It whispered through the tall grass like ghosts of forgotten wars, bending the earth in endless waves of green and gold beneath a sky so vast it made kings feel small and cities feel temporary. There were no walls here, no towers, no carved gates announcing power. The land itself was the ruler, harsh, open, merciless. This was a place that did not forgive weakness. Winter could kill a family in a single night. Summer drought could erase herds that meant the difference between life and death. Children learned early that survival was not a right, but a skill. Before they knew comfort, they knew cold. Before they knew stories, they knew hunger. And before they became men, they became riders. A boy was placed on a horse almost as soon as he could stand. His legs learned balance before they learned stillness.
Choose! Go! Faster, my friend!
His hands grew strong not from plows but from reins and bows. He did not see land as territory to own, he saw it as distance to cross, as space to move through like wind. To outsiders, it looked like emptiness. To those born there, it was freedom and battlefield. Tribes drifted across the plains like separate currents in a restless sea. They traded, raided, allied, betrayed. Blood feuds lasted generations. A stolen horse could start a war. Honor was remembered longer than mercy. Strength earned respect. Weakness invited erasure. Out of that chaos, leadership was not inherited, it was proven. And in that proving ground of cold nights and iron wills, a man rose who saw something others did not. Where others saw rival tribes, he saw pieces of a machine. Where others saw tradition, he saw limitation. Where others fought for survival, he imagined conquest. Genghis Khan had known hunger, humiliation, betrayal. He had been hunted, abandoned, enslaved. His step had tried to break him the way it broke many. Instead, it sharpened him. He understood the land because he was shaped by it. He understood men because he had suffered among them. And he understood that unity was more powerful than pride. He did what no one had managed before he tore apart the old tribal loyalties and rebuilt them into something new. Areas were grouped not by family, but by tens, hundreds, thousands. Loyalty shifted from clan to command. Promotion came from skill, not birth. Discipline replaced rivalry. He did not just gather an army. He engineered one. Every rider became part of a system that moved with terrifying precision. Signals carried across hills with flags and horns. Units could split, vanish, and reappear miles away in perfect coordination. Each man carried multiple bows, spare strings, and several horses, switching mounts to keep speed relentless. They did not crawl across land like traditional armies. They flowed. A Mongol force could cover distances that others thought impossible. They lived off dried meat, fermented milk, and the land itself. Supply lines, the weakness of great empires, meant little to them. Roads were unnecessary. Cities were optional. Mobility was everything. And then they began to test the world beyond the grass. The first cities they struck did not understand what was happening. Scouts reported riders on the horizon, then more. Then the sky darkened with arrows. Defenders prepared for sieges, for long waits behind walls. But these enemies did not always wait. They probed, withdrew, attacked supply routes, cut communications. They appeared where least expected, striking with speed that shattered plans before they could form. If a city resisted, destruction followed so complete it turned into legend. Smoke rose high enough to be seen for days. Survivors carried stories westward, stories of riders who showed no fear, who did not negotiate from weakness, who returned again and again like a nightmare that could not be woken from. Fear became their herald. Sometimes cities surrendered at the mere rumor of their approach. Gates opened not to mercy, but to avoid annihilation. The psychological blow traveled faster than the horses. The reputation of invincibility became a weapon sharper than any blade. Kingdoms fell in sequence. Fortified states that had stood for centuries crumbled in months. Armies formed to resist were lured into traps, surrounded, erased. Heavy infantry could not catch them. Traditional cavalry could not outmaneuver them. Generals who relied on rigid formations found themselves fighting ghosts. The riders would feign retreat, drawing enemies into pursuit. Lines stretched, order loosened, Then horns sounded, units wheeled, and the trap snapped shut. Arrows from all sides, confusion, collapse. It was not only strength, it was understanding. They studied enemies, learned their habits, exploited their expectations.
The army is assembled. We are ready. The terrain is mapped. We march at dawn. A wise plan. Victory will be ours. The men are eager. Let us ride.
They turned confidence into vulnerability. They turned discipline into rigidity. They turned courage into recklessness. And with every victory, the myth grew. They could not be stopped. That belief spread across continents. Merchants whispered it in markets. Envoys carried it between courts. Refugees brought it with haunted eyes and shaking hands. The riders became more than an army. They became a force of nature in the imagination of the world. Like a storm that never tired. Mountains slowed them, but did not stop them. Deserts tested them, but they adapted. Rivers were crossed. Kingdoms that had never imagined defeat faced annihilation. Great centers of power, confident in their history, fell to men who carried their homes on horseback. The storm kept rolling west, but the farther it went, the more stretched it became. Generals commanded vast distances from the center of power. Communication thinned. Rivalries buried under success stirred again. An empire built on speed and unity now spanned lands too wide for instant control. Yet to their enemies, none of that was visible. All they saw was the thunder of hooves growing louder. And in lands far to the southwest, beyond deserts that had swallowed countless armies, people began to hear the stories of cities erased, of scholars cut down, of rivers darkened with ash. The storm that had conquered so much was turning toward them. Most felt fear, some felt resignation. But somewhere beyond the reach of immediate destruction, a different reaction was forming, not panic, not denial, but attention. Careful, cold attention. Because among those lands were warriors who did not inherit their place. Men taken from childhood, trained without distraction, forged into soldiers whose lives belonged to discipline. They had been shaped by hardship, by training, by obedience, as strict as any on the steppe. They listened to the stories. They did not only hear terror, they heard patterns.
The northern passes are vulnerable. Then we fortify them. Show me the terrain. I'll mark the choke points. What about supplies? The routes are clear. Good. Prepare the orders.
And for the first time since the storm had begun its ride across the world, there were men preparing not just to survive it, but to understand it. The stories arrived before the army did. They came with men who no longer looked like men, but like shadows wearing human skin. Their clothes were burned, their voices cracked when they spoke. Some could not finish their sentences, others repeated the same words again and again, as if their minds had broken on what their eyes had seen. They came like the wind. They did not stop. There was nothing left. Caravans brought the whispers into crowded markets. Imams heard them after prayer. Scribes wrote fragments of them in margins, unsure whether history would believe such horror. Rulers listened from behind carved screens, faces hard, but hands tight around the arms of their thrones. The storm had reached the heart of the Islamic world. Hulagu Khan, grandson of the great conqueror, carried the legacy west with brutal certainty. His campaign was not just expansion, it was demonstration. Power made visible. Resistance punished so completely that memory itself trembled. When the riders and their siege engineers stood before Baghdad, the world held its breath. Baghdad was not just a city, it was a symbol, a center of knowledge, wealth, and faith. Its libraries held centuries of thought. Its markets connected continents. Its name carried weight in every court from Spain to India. Walls had protected it before. History had protected it before. This time, neither was enough. The Mongols did not only rely on speed anymore, they had learned from China, from Persia, from every civilization they had crushed. They brought engineers, catapults, siege towers, precision, patience. Stones smashed into walls that had stood for generations. Fire followed. Panic spread inside faster than orders could control. Defenders who had never imagined defeat watched their certainty crumble with the towers. When the city fell, it did not fall quietly. The slaughter lasted days. Streets that once echoed with trade and debate ran red. Scholars died beside soldiers. Wealth that had taken centuries to gather vanished in smoke and blood. The great libraries, the memory of a civilization, were thrown into the river. It was said the waters darkened with ink before they reddened with blood. The message was clear. If Baghdad could fall, nothing was safe. Across the region, rulers faced impossible choices. Resist and risk annihilation, surrender and hope for survival. Some sent tribute, some sent hostages, some fortified cities that would soon burn anyway. Fear did what armies could not. It weakened decisions, it fractured alliances, it made men choose safety over honor, survival over strategy. The storm fed on that. Yet the Mongol advance was not mindless destruction. It followed logic, control routes, break symbols, eliminate centers of resistance. Hulagu understood that crushing belief was as important as crushing armies. A civilization that no longer believed in its own strength would fall apart, and it almost worked. But further south, beyond the immediate reach of devastation, a different kind of power waited. In the land of the Nile, where desert met river and stone met sky, a military society had grown unlike any other. Its soldiers were not nobles, not tribal warriors, not volunteers. They were purchased as boys from distant lands, trained relentlessly, and forged into an elite corps whose loyalty was not to family, but to the institution that had remade them. They were the Mamluks. Cairo was no stranger to politics, intrigue, and sudden violence. Power shifted in corridors and courtyards. But beneath that surface turbulence stood an army hardened by constant training and internal struggle. Every commander had fought rivals. Every soldier had survived a system designed to break the weak. They had one advantage others did not. They were professional warriors in a world where many armies were part-time. They studied cavalry. They mastered archery from horseback. They drilled formations, discipline, response to signals. Their lives were war long before the Mongols threatened their borders, and among them were men who had faced steppe tactics before, men who recognized the patterns hidden inside the horror stories. They understood that the storm was not magic, it was method. They saw that Mongol victories relied on movement, deception, psychological collapse. They saw that enemies who panicked died faster than those who adapted. They saw that rigid defense invited encirclement. Most importantly, they understood something few dared to believe. The riders were not gods, they were men, fast, ruthless, brilliant in war, but still men, bound by terrain, fatigue, communication limits, and command structures stretched across continents. While other courts argued or despaired, these warriors began preparing in silence. Training intensified. Scouts listened for news. Leaders debated not whether the Mongols could be beaten, but how. Because if the storm was built on speed and confidence, then somewhere, somehow, it had to be slowed. And its confidence turned into a trap. The world still believed the riders could not lose, but belief can blind both sides. And as Hulagu's forces pushed deeper, confident in a history of victory, they did not yet see that the land ahead was different. Not open steppe, not easily crossed plains, but narrow approaches, broken terrain, places where mobility could be shaped, restricted, predicted. The storm was still moving, but for the first time since it began its ride across the world, someone was no longer just running from it. Someone was watching the sky, measuring the wind, and choosing the ground where the storm would finally be forced to fight. The Nile moved with a patience the steppe had never known. It did not rush like horses. It did not wander like tribes. It flowed with the certainty of something older than empires, older than faiths, older than memory. Every year it rose, and every year it fed the land, turning desert into life with a rhythm that felt eternal. Along its banks, cities stood not as temporary camps, but as statements. Stone, minarets, markets, citadels. Civilizations had risen and fallen here for thousands of years, yet the river endured, indifferent to kings and conquerors alike. It was in this land of rhythm and stone that the storm from the steppe would meet something it did not fully understand. Power here did not pass gently from father to son. It was taken. The soldiers who guarded the throne were not born into noble houses. They were brought as boys from distant frontiers, Turkic lands, Caucasus mountains, steppe regions, taken from families they would never see again. They arrived speaking different tongues, carrying different memories. Then those memories were stripped away. Civilizations had risen and fallen here for thousands of years, yet the river endured, indifferent to kings and conquerors alike. It was in this land of rhythm and stone that the storm from the steppe would meet something it did not fully understand. Power here did not pass gently from father to son. It was taken. The soldiers who guarded the throne were not born into noble houses. They were brought as boys from distant frontiers, Turkic lands, Caucasus mountains, steppe regions, taken from families they would never see again. They arrived speaking different tongues, carrying different memories. Then those memories were stripped away.
My people, hear my decree. Our enemies gather at the gates. We shall meet them with steel and fire. Victory is our destiny.
In their barracks and training fields, bonds formed stronger than blood. They had no tribes to divide them, no inherited feuds to distract them. Their brotherhood was forged in survival and shared hardship. Each man knew the one beside him had endured the same breaking and rebuilding. And unlike many armies of the time, this was not a force called only when needed. This was a society of warriors. While merchants traded and scholars debated, the Mamluks trained. While courtiers whispered politics, they practiced maneuvers. Their lives were a preparation for wars that might never come, until now. News from the north arrived like dust on the wind. Baghdad had fallen, Syria trembled. Cities that had stood for centuries were ash. Refugees poured south, carrying terror in their eyes and details in fragments. Fast riders, endless arrows, feigned retreats, sudden encirclements. Most listeners heard doom. Mamluk commanders heard data. They gathered accounts, compared stories, looked past the horror into the patterns.
The passes are held. We advance from the east. The eastern flank is vulnerable, my lord. We need more archers on the left. Agreed. See to the reinforcements.
They did not dismiss the Mongols as savages nor exaggerate them into demons. They studied them the way hunters study a predator that has never been caught. Fast cavalry, horse archers, fluid formations, psychological warfare, relentless pursuit. It was a language they understood, because the Mamluks were also masters of mounted combat. They too had trained from youth in the saddle. They too could loose arrows at full gallop, wheel formations, respond to signals. Their armor was heavier, their discipline rigid, their cohesion drilled to instinct. But there was something else. They had a homeland to defend. The Mongols fought to expand horizons, to prove supremacy, to carry forward a legacy of conquest. The Mamluks fought with their backs to the Nile, to Cairo, to the heart of their world. Behind them were cities filled with families, faith, history. Retreat for them was not strategy, it was extinction. In Cairo, tension moved through the citadel like a current. Courtyards filled with armored men, horses stamped in shaded stables. Messengers rode in and out at all hours. The political games that once consumed attention grew quieter, replaced by a shared understanding that something greater than ambition was approaching. At the center of that storm of preparation stood a man who had not been born to rule, but had taken the throne in a moment of crisis. Qutuz had risen through the same system that shaped every Mamluk, from bondage to command, through strength and survival. He was not soft with luxury, not detached from the army. He knew the men he led because he had stood where they stood. He understood what the fall of Baghdad meant.
Warriors, the time has come to reclaim our destiny from these ancient stones. With steel and courage, victory will be ours. Lead us to glory.
Not just a city lost, but a psychological blow meant to shatter resistance before battle began. If fear spread unchecked, cities might surrender without a fight, fracturing the region before swords even crossed. So he did something that changed the mood of his realm. He refused to bow. When Mongol envoys arrived, carrying demands of submission wrapped in the certainty of past victories, Qutuz did not see inevitability. He saw a test. To surrender would preserve lives for a moment, perhaps, but at the cost of dignity, autonomy, future. To resist might mean death, but it also meant a chance to break the chain of defeats that had paralyzed the world. In the citadel, before commanders and courtiers, the decision crystallized. They would fight, not from behind walls waiting to be surrounded and starved, not in panic, chasing shadows across open ground. They would choose their moment, their terrain, their plan, because somewhere among the Mamluk ranks was a commander who had once lived closer to the steppe than the Nile, a man who had seen Mongol methods up close, who understood the rhythm of their attacks, the confidence behind their feigned retreats, the arrogance born from unbroken victory. Baybars. He knew the storm's language. He knew that the Mongols believed no one could match their mobility, no one could outthink their tactics. That belief had opened cities before a single arrow flew. It had turned resistance into hesitation. So the answer forming in the minds of these warriors was not brute strength. It was reflection. If the storm thrived on speed, it must be channeled. If it thrived on fear, it must be deny. If it thrived on deception, it must be deceived. The Nile Valley did not look like the steppe. Its terrain narrowed, broken by hills, wadis, and cultivated land. Movement could be shaped, routes could be predicted. Ambushes could be hidden where open plains did not exist. The Mamluks were not preparing to withstand the storm, they were preparing to lure it. And far to the north, Mongol riders still moved with the confidence of men who had never known true defeat, unaware that ahead of them, beyond the deserts, for the first time in their long ride across the world, the storm was not only being feared, it was being studied, measured, and quietly invited forward. It shifted like a blade in a practiced hand, quiet, precise, deadly when needed. The city's minarets rose into the blue, markets hummed with trade, scholars argued over law and scripture, but beneath that living surface ran a constant tension. The Mamluk world was built by warriors, and warriors did not live long under weak rulers. The coming storm sharpened everything. Messengers arrived dust-covered, horses lathered, bringing fragments of news from Syria. Mongol detachments moved like probing fingers, testing roads, assessing resistance. Cities that hesitated fell quickly. Those that submitted vanished into silence. The illusion of distance was gone. War was not a rumor anymore. It was a direction. Inside the citadel, Qutuz stood at the center of decisions that would define not just his rule, but the survival of his realm. He was not surrounded by soft men. Every commander there had scars beneath his armor, rivalries behind his loyalty. The Mamluk elite had risen through violence. They respected strength because they had survived only by proving it. To lead them into battle against an enemy believed invincible required more than authority. It required conviction. Yet even as preparations accelerated, horses gathered, weapons inspected, scouts dispatched, Qutuz knew that the key to facing the Mongols was not numbers alone. He did not carry the calm of a courtier. He carried the alertness of someone who had survived too much to trust stillness. His eyes missed little. His speech was direct, edged with the bluntness of a soldier who valued clarity over politeness. He had fought steppe warriors before. He had watched their feigned retreats pull eager pursuers into disaster. He had seen how they stretched enemy lines until order dissolved into fragments. He knew the rhythm of their attacks, the false weakness, the sudden turn, the storm of arrows from every side. He also knew their confidence. The Mongols expected fear. They expected hesitation. They expected enemies to react, not to dictate. That expectation could be used. In councils thick with the smell of oil lamps and leather armor, maps were unrolled across low tables, not ornate charts, but practical knowledge. Routes between cities, water sources, narrow passes, rolling ground where cavalry could maneuver and where it would struggle. Syria lay between the storm and Egypt, a land of crossroads and corridors. Whoever controlled its terrain controlled the approach. To wait behind Cairo's walls would surrender initiative. To charge blindly north would invite the same fate as others who had underestimated the storm. The decision formed like a blade being forged, heated by debate, hammered by urgency. They would march north, not to chase, not to flee, but to meet the Mongols on ground chosen carefully. Ground that broke open expanses into controlled space. Ground where ambush could hide behind hills, where movement could be predicted instead of free. Baybars argued for more than terrain. He argued for psychology. Their greatest weapon, he insisted, is not the bow, it is belief. Belief that they could not be beaten, belief that retreat from them meant survival, pursuit meant victory, that enemies would always break first. So the Mamluks would not meet them with rigid defense, they would mirror them, they would show retreat, They would appear vulnerable, they would invite the chase. To many commanders, the idea tasted like risk. Feigned retreat required discipline so absolute that panic never replaced performance. One mistake, one unit breaking for real, and the deception would turn into disaster. But the Mamluk army was built for discipline. Their training had burned reaction into muscle. Signals, formations, coordinated movement, these were not hopes, they were habits. If any force could attempt such a maneuver against the masters of it, it was this one. Still, there was another truth coiling beneath strategy. Time. The Mongol Empire, vast beyond imagination, did not move as one solid body anymore. Campaigns far from the core depended on generals acting with autonomy. Reinforcements took time, communication stretched thin. Hulagu himself was not at every battlefield. The storm was powerful, but not omnipresent. If the Mamluks could strike decisively, destroy a major Mongol force, the psychological shock would travel as far as the earlier terror had. The myth of invincibility would crack. And when myths crack, empires tremble. As preparations neared completion, the city watched the army gather. Columns of cavalry rode out beneath the sun, armor glinting, banners stirring. Hooves beat a steady rhythm through the gates, past walls that had guarded Cairo for generations. Civilians lined the streets in silence. Some prayed, some wept quietly. Others simply watched, knowing that the men passing them were riding toward an enemy no one had yet defeated. At the head rode Qutuz, not hidden behind layers of ceremony, but visible, a soldier among soldiers, bearing the weight of decision openly. Beside and behind him, commanders like Baybars carried a different burden. The knowledge that they were not just marching to fight a battle, they were marching to confront an idea. That no one could stand against the storm. Northward they rode across deserts that shimmered in the heat, through lands already scarred by the advance of the Mongols. Ruined settlements marked the path, blackened stones and empty wells, silent testimony to what happened when resistance failed. Each ruin was a warning, each mile a narrowing of distance between legend and reality. The Mongols did not yet know exactly where the confrontation would occur. They moved with the confidence of habit, expecting enemies to scatter, cities to fold. Their scouts saw movement, resistance forming, but nothing that suggested a trap, because no one before had dared to build one. Between hills and open land in northern Palestine lay a place where routes converged, where water and pasture made armies pause, where terrain could hide more than it revealed. A place that did not look like destiny, but destiny often waits in ordinary ground. As the two forces moved closer, the air itself seemed to tighten, like the moment before a storm breaks. Not with rain, but with iron and blood. For the first time since the riders had burst from the steppe and rolled across continents, they were approaching an enemy who did not intend to run, who did not intend to hide, who had spent weeks preparing not just to survive the storm, but to turn its own fury back upon it. Dawn came quietly over the hills. A thin light spilled across the land, touching stone, scrub and grass with a pale gold that hid the violence about to unfold. The air was cool, almost gentle, carrying the scent of earth and distant water. Birds moved in the brush. Wind whispered over the ground as if nothing in the world was about to change. But men were already awake. Horses shifted, metal whispered against leather, breath steamed in the early chill. Across the uneven terrain near the spring of Ain Jalut, two armies moved into positions shaped not by chance, but by intention. This was not open steppe. Low hills rolled like frozen waves, broken ground interrupting long sightlines. Valleys narrowed, then widened unexpectedly. Patches of brush and folds in the earth concealed movement until the last moment. It was land that forced cavalry to funnel, to commit, to choose direction before seeing the whole field. Baybars had chosen it carefully. His forward cavalry rode first, visible, deliberate. They did not hide, they wanted to be seen. Their banners moved in the wind, their horses restless, their armor catching light. They looked like an advance force meeting the storm head-on. Behind hills and ridges, unseen, the rest of the Mamluk army waited. Units held in disciplined silence, horses controlled with knees and quiet hands. Commanders watched the ridgelines, ears tuned for signals. Every man knew his role. Every movement had been drilled in the mind before it would be demanded in blood. Across the field, Mongol scouts crested rises and scanned the land. They saw what they expected, an enemy force forward, bold but exposed. Resistance, yes, but not something beyond the pattern of past victories. Messages rode back. Their commander, Kidbuka, was no careless fool. A veteran of campaigns that had crushed cities and armies, he trusted speed, shock, relentless pressure. He knew hesitation could give enemies time to gather courage. Better to strike, break the front, scatter resistance before it solidified. The Mongol vanguard formed with fluid precision. Horse archers fanned wide, heavy cavalry poised behind. Drums beat, horns carried commands across distance. Lines did not look rigid. They breathed, shifting, ready to surge like water released from a dam. Then they came. The ground trembled under thousands of hooves. Dust rose, blurring the horizon. Arrows darkened the morning, hissing through air toward the visible Mamluk front. The sound was like rain striking earth, relentless, unbroken. Baybars' men answered with their own volleys, but they did not hold firm. They began to give ground, not in panic, in rhythm. They turned, withdrew, loosed arrows over shoulders, then pulled back again. To watching Mongols it was familiar. Enemy resistance faltering, pressure working, the first stage of collapse. Kidbuka pushed harder, units advanced, spreading to encircle, cutting off escape routes, as they had done so many times before. The Mongol system was built for this moment. The chase, the tightening ring, the final blow to fleeing foes. The Mamluk front retreated further into the broken terrain, drawing the Mongols along narrow approaches between rises that blocked wide maneuver. Dust and noise swallowed clear vision. Signals had to be relayed fast, decisions made without full view of the field. Behind the hills, unseen riders tightened grips on reins, waiting. The retreat continued longer than usual. A Mongol commander might have wondered, but success breeds expectation. They had seen this before, resistance dissolving under pressure, enemy discipline cracking. They pressed on. Then a horn sounded, sharp, different. Baybars' front ranks wheeled, not scattered, not broken. They turned as one. Arrows flew back into faces that had been riding forward in confidence. The rhythm shifted in a heartbeat. Mongol riders, mid-pursuit, suddenly faced resistance hardening instead of collapsing. Before surprise could turn to adjustment, another sound rolled across the hills, deeper, layered, multiplied. Mamluk horns. From behind ridges and hidden folds in the land, cavalry surged into view. Lines that had been invisible now poured down slopes, armor flashing, banners snapping. Units struck not at the front, but at the flanks of the Mongol force that had stretched itself in pursuit. The trap closed. Mongol mobility, their greatest strength, was constricted. The terrain that had seemed harmless now broke formations, limited sweeping maneuvers. Commands had to fight through noise and confusion. Dust thickened, turning vision into fragments. Still, they did not collapse. These were veterans of 100 battles. They regrouped fast, wheeling units to meet the new threats, arrows flying in disciplined storms. The field became a storm of motion, charges, withdrawals, close combat in bursts of steel and muscle. At the center, Qutuz rode forward where fighting was fiercest. His presence was not symbolic. He moved among his men, rallying, reinforcing, turning wavering moments back into momentum. When parts of the line bent under pressure, reserves were committed with precision, plugging gaps before they widened. The clash was not one-sided. Mamluk horses fell, men were pulled from saddles, arrows found joints in armor. The Mongols fought with the same ferocity that had shattered empires. Their commanders tried to reassert the fluid patterns that had always brought victory. But something fundamental had changed. They were not dictating the battle, they were reacting. Every time they pushed to regain open space, Mamluk units blocked, harassed, forced them back into constrained ground. Every attempt to create the wide encirclements that defined their victories met resistance shaped by terrain and preparation. Hours stretched, heat rose, dust turned sweat to mud on faces. Then a moment came, small in time, enormous in consequence. Kitbuka was cut down. Leadership in Mongol armies was more than authority, it was cohesion. Signals, coordination, timing all depended on command functioning smoothly. With their general fallen amid chaos, the rhythm faltered. Confusion rippled. Units still fought bravely, but unity thinned. The belief that had carried them across continents, that victory was inevitable, wavered under the weight of a battle that refused to follow the script. The Mamluks pressed. Their horns sounded again and again, waves of cavalry striking, pulling back, striking anew. What had begun as a trap now became pursuit in reverse. Mongol lines, once the hunters, found themselves hunted, pressed toward retreat routes that no longer offered the easy escape of open steppe. For the first time in living memory, Mongol riders felt something unfamiliar in their chests. Not just danger, doubt. And as the sun climbed higher over the field of Ain Jalut, the storm that had rolled across continents found itself breaking, not against walls, not against numbers, but against discipline, terrain, and a plan forged in the understanding of how storms move. The battle was not yet done, but the myth had begun to bleed. Something changed in the air before anyone named it. Not a sound, not a signal, a feeling. For years, the Mongol advance had carried a certainty that seeped into every clash. Even in hard fighting, there had always been a moment when resistance cracked, when the enemy's will broke and the familiar collapse began. They had come to expect it the way a rider expects a trained horse to answer the reins. Here, that moment did not come. Again and again they pushed, and again the line did not shatter. Mamluk riders bent, regrouped, returned. Horns called fresh units into gaps before those gaps became wounds. What should have been unraveling turned instead into tightening resistance.
Warriors, the storm is ours, our savage Uligech! Let the thunder of our hooves shake the earth!
Confidence, that invisible armor worn by the conquerors of continents, began to feel heavier. The death of Kitbuka spread not in a single shout, but in fragments. A rider who did not see his banner where it should be, a unit waiting for an order that never arrived, a messenger searching through dust for a commander already fallen. Leadership did not vanish instantly, but the seamless flow of command frayed, and Mongol warfare depended on flow. Without precise coordination, their fluid maneuvers became harder to execute. Units fought bravely, skillfully, but in smaller pieces. The great machine of movement that had crushed armies now moved in sections, each part still dangerous, but less than the whole. The Mamluks felt it, not as relief, not yet, but as a shift, the resistance of an enemy that was no longer fully certain. Qutuz, riding near the heart of the struggle, saw wavering where before there had been relentless pressure. He raised his voice, calling men forward, urging pursuit where moments earlier defense had been the priority.
Why to me? Late bomb! Press the attack, no quarter!
It was not reckless.
We are victorious!
It was timing. Mamluk cavalry pressed harder, arrows and lances driving into Mongol formations that were trying to regain space. Instead of being drawn out and surrounded, the pursuers now found themselves meeting countercharges from fresh Mamluk units emerging from folds in the terrain. For the first time in living memory, Mongol riders turned not as part of a planned, feigned retreat, but because the ground ahead no longer promised advantage. The motion was subtle at first, a pullback to regroup, to re-establish order. But in the chaos of battle, subtle movements carry loud consequences. Nearby units mirrored the shift. Dust and noise turned intent into confusion. What was meant as adjustment began to look like withdrawal, and withdrawal, once begun, has its own gravity. Mamluk horns sounded again, long and fierce. Cavalry surged, no longer measuring distance in caution, but in opportunity. Years of training to hold formation now gave way to controlled aggression. They had waited for this moment, when the storm's forward force faltered. The Mongols still fought savagely. Rearguard units turned to face pursuers, arrows cutting down those who pressed too recklessly. But their great advantage and the ability to shape battle's rhythm had slipped. They were no longer setting the pace. They were being driven. Across the field of Ain Jalut, the pattern reversed. The hunters became the hunted. Mamluk riders, who had spent the morning retreating by design, now advanced with the momentum of belief. The myth of invincibility, once a weapon in Mongol hands, was cracking, and both sides felt it.
Warriors! The storm favors our Chatagna!
Some Mongol groups broke away in disciplined retreat, seeking routes north towards safer ground. Others became isolated, surrounded in pockets of resistance that burned bright and brief before being extinguished. The dust that had hidden movements now revealed something new, space opening behind Mongol lines where none should have been. By afternoon, the outcome no longer hid impossibility. The storm that had rolled across continents had met a force that refused to dissolve, and in that refusal, its aura had shattered. What had seemed unstoppable had been slowed, trapped, struck at its center. Men on both sides still died, steel still rang, but history had already tilted. Word would carry faster than any rider. The Mongols had been stopped, not by walls, not by numbers, but by an army that understood them, by leaders who chose ground and timing, by discipline that held where fear might have broken others. On that field, beneath a sun now harsh and high, something greater than an army had fallen, the certainty of eternal victory. And once that certainty died, the world itself began to change. Victory did not bring silence. It brought a different kind of noise. The low, exhausted sounds of men and animals who had pushed beyond limits. Horses staggered, sides heaving, armor was unbuckled with shaking hands. Wounded men called for water, for help, for brothers who would not answer. The field of Ain Jalut was no longer a place of movement, but of aftermath. Dust settled slowly, revealing what battle always leaves behind. Broken weapons, fallen banners, men who had been alive that morning, now still beneath the sky. The heat pressed down, indifferent to who had won, but among the Mamluks, beneath the fatigue and the cost, something else moved, a realization. They had done what no one had done. They had not just survived the storm, they had broken it. Messengers rode out quickly, carrying news south and across the region. Every hoofbeat carried more than information. It carried disbelief turning into hope. Cities that had been waiting for annihilation would soon hear that the riders from the east had bled and lost. Yet within the Mamluk ranks, celebration did not come easily. These were men shaped by struggle and rivalry as much as by discipline. Victory in battle did not erase ambition. Power among them had always followed strength, and strength, once displayed, could shift loyalties like wind over sand. At the center of it all rode Qutuz. He had led them north. He had chosen to fight when others might have bowed. On the field, his presence had steadied lines, pushed men forward, turned moments of danger into renewed resolve. Without him, the confrontation might never have happened. But leadership in the Mamluk world was never simple gratitude. As the army moved northward in the days after the battle, clearing remaining Mongol positions, reclaiming cities that had fallen into fear, tension traveled with them. Commanders spoke quietly among trusted men. Eyes measured strength, influence, support.
The enemy gathers here. We must strike before dawn. Our scouts report their numbers are greater than we thought. Numbers mean nothing. We have surprise on our side. Then we attack from the east as the plan shows. Agreed.
Baybars rode with the army too, his reputation now sharpened by victory. His tactical mind had helped shape the trap. His units had executed the retreat that drew the Mongols in. Soldiers respected him. Many admired him. In a system where rulers were once slaves and generals could become sultans, success on the battlefield was not only honor, it was leverage. The march continued. Syria opened again to Mamluk control, towns receiving them not with resistance, but relief. The storm had been turned back, but power, like the Nile, does not stay still. Somewhere along the road, beneath a sky that had watched empires rise and fall for centuries, the balance shifted. Accounts differ in detail, but not in outcome. Qutuz, the Sultan who had faced the Mongols without surrender, was suddenly gone, killed in the wake of victory in a moment that mixed ambition, rivalry, and the ruthless logic of Mamluk politics. His death did not undo the triumph at Ain Jalut. But it changed who would carry its legacy. Baybars emerged not just as a commander of skill, but as ruler. His rise was not a break from the Mamluk pattern, it was its continuation. Power followed proven strength, and he had proven his on the field where the world believed defeat inevitable. Under him, the Mamluk state did not relax. It hardened further, fortresses strengthened, borders watched, armies drilled. The lesson of the storm was clear. Survival belonged to those who prepared before danger reached their gates. Qutuz's name would be remembered with the battle, linked forever to the decision to resist. Baybars' name would be tied to what followed: consolidation, expansion, the shaping of a state that would stand as a barrier between the Mongol world and the lands beyond. On the surface, it was a familiar story: victory, power struggle, a new ruler.
Warriors, we stand at the threshold of history. We are ready, my lord. Then rise and let our enemies tremble!
But beneath it lay something deeper. The first major Mongol defeat had not only altered military maps, it had altered belief across courts, markets, armies. The aura of inevitability had been pierced, and that change in belief was as powerful as any sword. Men who once surrendered at rumors might now consider resistance. Leaders who had despaired might now plan. The storm was still vast, still dangerous, but it was no longer untouchable, and that knowledge, born in blood on a field between hills and spring water, would echo far beyond the men who fought there. Because sometimes history turns not only on who wins, but on who proves the impossible can be broken. News of the victory traveled faster than armies. It moved along trade routes, through caravanserais, across ports where ships carried silk and spices, and now something rarer: hope. Riders reached cities with dust still on their cloaks, voices hoarse, telling a story people leaned forward to hear, as if afraid sound itself might shatter it. The Mongols had been defeated. At first, many did not believe it. Too many tales of their triumphs had carved the idea of their invincibility into the minds of the age. Whole regions had surrendered without testing that belief. Fear had been their advance guard, opening gates before hooves reached them. Now, fear hesitated. In Damascus, Aleppo, and towns that had expected ruin, the news changed posture, tone, breath. Walls that had seemed like fragile illusions felt solid again. Men who had hidden weapons brought them back into the light. Leaders who had calculated surrender began recalculating resistance. A single battle had not destroyed the Mongol Empire, but it had shattered its aura. The psychological current shifted in ways no sword could measure. Until Ain Jalut, the Mongol advance had felt like a law of nature, unstoppable, inevitable. After it, they were still powerful, still feared, but now they were something else too: beatable. That change rippled outward. In the Islamic world, the Mamluks emerged not just as defenders of Egypt, but as the shield of the region. Their victory gave them legitimacy beyond politics. They had stood where others fell. Their cavalry, their discipline, their leadership became the standard against which others measured themselves. Under Baybars, fortresses along the frontier were reinforced, garrisons strengthened, alliances reshaped. The lesson was not complacency. The storm might return. Preparation had to be constant. Further west, in lands that had watched the Mongol shadow creep closer over the years, rulers listened closely. Europe had already felt the riders in earlier invasions, had heard of cities burned and armies crushed. The idea that someone had halted them in open battle changed calculations far beyond the Middle East. Diplomacy shifted. Envoys carried new tones in their messages. Resistance no longer seemed an act of blind desperation, but of possible success. Even within the Mongol world, the defeat mattered. Empires built on conquest draw strength from momentum. Victories feed confidence, unity, loyalty. Defeats raise questions. They do not collapse empires alone, but they introduce cracks, doubts about commanders, about strategy, about destiny itself. The myth of endless victory had been part of Mongol power. At Ain Jalut, that myth bled. Yet the deeper legacy was not only military or political, it was civilizational. Baghdad had fallen, cities had burned, knowledge had been lost, but the chain of destruction had been interrupted. The centers of learning and culture further south and west had time time to adapt, to rebuild, to continue traditions that might otherwise have been erased under the hooves of the storm. History often turns on time bought at terrible cost. The field near the spring of Ain Jalut became one of those turning points. Not the end of conflict, not the end of Mongol power, but the end of inevitability. The world had seen that preparation, discipline, leadership, and understanding of an enemy could do what fear said was impossible. Long after the dust settled and the bodies were buried, that lesson remained. Empires rise on strength. They endure on belief. And sometimes all it takes to change the course of centuries is one day when belief shifts, when the storm meets ground that does not give way. On that day, in a landscape that looked ordinary under the sun, history itself took a different path. People would later ask the question in simpler words: what was the secret weapon? They expected an object, a new blade, a hidden machine, some invention that tipped the balance at the last moment. It was easier to believe history turned on a tool than on choices made long before swords crossed. But on the field of Ain Jalut, no mysterious device emerged from behind the hills. The weapon had been forged long before the battle began. It began with understanding.
The northern passes are vulnerable. We must reinforce them. Agreed, and we should deploy cavalry to the western flank. I will mark the supply routes. The terrain here is treacherous.
Most of the world had faced the Mongols as something alien, a force so different that normal rules no longer applied. Fear magnified their strength, turned strategy into panic, resistance into hesitation. Armies fought not only the riders, but the belief that defeat was certain. The Mamluks chose differently. They did not worship the myth. They studied the method. They listened to refugees not only for horror, but for pattern. They noticed how often defeats began with pursuit.
My people, we stand at a crossroads. Unity is our only path forward. But at what cost, Elder? We must protect our own.
The cost of inaction is greater. We must decide now.
How often lines stretched, how often commanders reacted instead of controlled. They saw that Mongol victories depended on shaping the enemy's behavior, so they reshaped their own. Discipline became shield and spear at once. Retreat was not shame, it was movement. Patience was not weakness, it was timing. Their training allowed them to act against instinct, to pull back when pride urged charge, to hold formation when fear urged flight. That was one edge of the weapon. The other was terrain. The Mongols were masters of open space, where speed could unfold without interruption. Many had tried to meet them there and paid the price. At Ain Jalut, the ground itself became part of the plan. Hills, narrow approaches, broken land, all of it constrained the sweeping maneuvers that had destroyed others.
Warriors, marksmen, men! Flee!
The Mamluks did not rely on the land alone. They combined it with deception. Their feigned retreat was not imitation for its own sake. It was reflection aimed at the enemy's expectations. The Mongols had built success on drawing enemies into traps. Now they were drawn by the same instinct. Confidence, the invisible armor that had protected them, became weight. And then there was leadership. Qutuz's decision to resist when surrender seemed safer gave the army its chance to fight at all. Baybars' tactical mind shaped how that fight would unfold. Commanders across the field responded to signals, committed reserves at the right moment, prevented small failures from becoming collapse. No single man was the weapon, but without those men, the weapon could not function.
Brothers, the enemy gathers. We must strike now. My scouts report their numbers are vast. Numbers mean nothing. Our spirits are unbreakable. For the Khan, for victory!
Timing sharpened everything. The Mongol forces in the region were formidable, but not the full weight of the empire. Distance, communication delays, and divided commands meant the storm was not a single wave, but many currents. The Mamluks struck one of those currents hard enough to break its momentum before reinforcements could change the balance. The weapon then was not steel. It was a combination, understanding over fear, discipline over impulse, chosen ground over open exposure, deception used deliberately, leadership willing to risk everything, timing that turned opportunity into decision. Each part alone would not have been enough. Together they became something the Mongols had not faced before, an enemy who fought on their terms only to turn those terms inside out. That is why the victory mattered beyond numbers or casualties. It proved that the storm's strength had structure, and what has structure can be studied, countered, broken. The secret weapon was never hidden. It was built piece by piece, in training fields, in councils of war, in the refusal to surrender to inevitability. On the day of battle, it did not appear suddenly. It simply worked. Long after the field had returned to grass and wind, the memory of that day remained sharper than steel. Empires moved on, wars followed wars, names of kings rose and faded. But the echo of Ain Jalut did not disappear into the past like so many battles. It lingered, woven into decisions, fears, ambitions of generations who had never seen the field. Because the legacy of that day was not only victory, it was interruption. History is often imagined as a river flowing forward with unstoppable force. The Mongol expansion had seemed like that, a current no bank could contain, sweeping away cities, armies, beliefs. At Ain Jalut, that river did not dry up, but it struck rock, it changed course. The Mongols remained powerful, their empire vast, yet after that defeat, their expansion into the heart of the Middle East never carried the same aura of inevitability. Campaigns continued, clashes followed, but the sense that the world could only fall back before them was gone. In Egypt and Syria, the Mamluk state hardened into a frontier civilization. Always alert, always armed, always ready. Fortresses rose like teeth along vulnerable approaches. Cavalry traditions deepened. Generations trained with the knowledge that discipline and preparation had once saved their world. Their identity became tied to guardianship. They were not merely rulers of a land. They were the shield that had held far beyond their borders. The lesson traveled. Resistance against overwhelming force was not foolish by default. Strategy, leadership, and understanding could bend even the most terrifying tide. Courts that had once surrendered at rumor now paused to think. Armies reconsidered how they fought, what ground they chose, how they trained. The psychological map of the world shifted, and beneath all of it lay a quieter legacy. Time. Civilizations do not survive only through brilliance or faith. They survive through time. Time to adapt, to rebuild, to pass knowledge forward. The fall of Baghdad had shown how quickly centuries could vanish in smoke. The stand at Ain Jalut bought time for what remained. Scholars would write, traders would travel, cities would live, argue, build, remember. The thread of culture, nearly severed, continued. On the Mongol side, the defeat became part of their own history, a reminder that even the greatest war machine has limits, that success cannot erase terrain, distance, human decision. Empires born in fire must still contend with the shape of the world. And for those who look back centuries later, the battle offers something beyond dates and names. It shows that myths can be broken, that fear, however justified, is not strategy, that understanding an enemy can matter more than matching his strength, that leadership in moments of dread can redirect the course of history more than comfort in times of peace. The field itself remains unremarkable to the eye: hills, open ground, wind moving through grass. Nothing in the soil announces that belief shifted there, that the idea of invincibility bled into dust under the sun. But history remembers, because on that day when riders who had conquered continents met warriors who refused to yield, the world learned a truth as old as war itself. No storm lasts forever. And sometimes the most powerful weapon is not what you wield in your hand, but what you build in your mind long before the battle begins.